Now that we've learned about what music theory is and the elements of music, now let's move on to the next lesson, which is really the symbols of music. These are the things that musicians, when they're reading music off of sheet music, it's the different parts of music that we need to understand what they mean in order to produce the music that a composer was intending. But remember that not all music has to be composed that way. Not all music is written down. Sometimes a songwriter will write a piece of music in their head, figure it out on the instrument, and sing the melody they wrote and created, and then they perform the music without ever anything being written down. The symbols are there. Maybe later someone will transcribe what they wrote down and write it down, but the symbols don't necessarily have to be there for the music to be there. But they are what was created so the idea of a composer could take place. Not all composers are necessarily performers. And the large works, like orchestral works, choral works, band works, they have to be performed by multiple performers. And in order for that to happen, there has to be some type of symbology that they use in order to play the right pitches, make the right dynamics, all those elements come together, and the symbols help us guide through that. When I'm teaching young students, little students, I equate the symbols of music to the alphabet. We know from kindergarten or even before when we start learning our letters that they mean something to us. They stand for something. All they do is symbolize a sound. An A, in our language we know, symbolizes the sound A or sometimes So when we're reading words, we put those symbols of letters together and then they symbolize a word and we read that word. There are cultures that don't have written alphabets. We can still speak without having the alphabet always there in front of our face to know how to do it. Music is the same way. The symbols are there. We use them so we can play music that a composer intends, but they don't necessarily have to be there in order to make music. And just remember that. Music theory is what it is. It is there to help us understand music. That's why we study it. And of course that goes back to lesson 1. So let's get on with learning just the first building blocks of music theory, the symbols of music, and that will be the staff. That's the very first thing we see, and we need to understand why it exists. The very first thing when writing music down and using the symbols of music, the very first thing you're going to usually use is the staff. And the staff is basically 5 lines and 4 spaces. When we place other symbols on that staff, then it tells the musician and or the composer more about what those symbols mean. The staff was actually developed not in history that long ago. It was the 12th century, the 1100s. There was a guy in Arezzo, Italy, named Guido de Arezzo, and he was a monk that taught children music. And he created a lot of stuff that we still do today, but the staff was one of the things that he is credited for in a very basic sense. The first thing he created was a red line on a piece of paper that words were placed underneath. And at the time, what we refer to as notes today were called neumes. They were quite a bit different. They're similar, but different to what we have today. And they were placed below, on, or above that line. And that line was like a bass line. Not a bass as in bass sound, but like a bass line as a place to start. They had been using neumes before that, but there was no relativity of low and high pitch. Obviously, when they had the line of words, that kind of gave them a bass line, and then the neumes were above and below that. And when I talk about notes later, we'll talk about the fact that notes have been around for even longer, as far as we can tell, or some type of notation for musicians to use so they could sing songs or play songs, but mostly sing songs that could be handed down generation to generation, not just orally, but could be written down. So anyway, he has this red line. And from that red line, then he starts realizing he needs more. He needs more ways to show high pitch and low pitch and not just be relative, but actually more succinct. And so he starts adding lines. And he gets to a point where he has 4 lines and 3 spaces. But there's a little bit more to the story. Other musicians and other composers after Arezzo started adding more lines and spaces. They started adding lines to deal with the higher range of people's voices and as they added instruments to deal with that. And they got to in some places there was many lines and spaces to it where it got very cumbersome to figure out what pitch was what pitch. So it was kind of settled on about 300 years after Lorenzo, somewhere around there, that there would be 5 lines and 4 spaces. And then if we needed to go above or below them, we would add little lines. And again, that's ledger lines, and I'll talk about that a little bit too. But the most important symbol that comes after the staff is the clef that's placed on the staff. And the first clef most of us come into contact with when we're learning music is the treble clef staff. So let's take a look at that. So here is your lines and spaces, a staff with nothing else on it. And then we want to add a clef. So we're going to add a clef that most of us refer to and understand as a treble clef. Now the treble clef is also known as the G clef because where it circles around in this part, as you can see the cursor, it's circling around the line that we call the note G. Or if I place a note on that line, it is the note G. So we have referred to it as the G clef. The next thing that is placed on a staff that helps us, again, as musicians, understand how music's put together are bar lines. They're lines that go the other direction. They run perpendicular to the staff lines, and they look like this. Now you notice that we have bar lines that go up and down. Then at the end we have a final bar line, and it's heavier, darker. And that one says at the end of a piece of music. Now this is a very short little thing here that we're using, but it's just to show you how the symbols work. So now we have 3 symbols. We have the staff, we have the treble clef, and we have bar lines. The next most important symbol is a set of numbers that tells us what the meter is. Now meter, I think we talk about this in Elements of Music, is the feel of the music. We either have a duple, 1, 2, 1, 2, or things that are divisible by 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. And what that refers to, like I talked about in lesson 1, is the strong and weak beats of music, which we all feel. We feel that rhythm of music, and within the rhythm there are beats. So you have triple and duple meters. The most common way that we show meter in music is with a symbol called the time signature. And the most common time signature is 4/4 time signature. 2 numbers, one stacked on top of the other. And please remember, this is not a fraction. Unfortunately, too many times we're taught that they look like a fraction. They kind of act like a fraction, and that's true to a certain extent, but they're not a fraction. They're just 2 numbers stacked on top of each other that tell us some things. So here's what a time signature looks like. And now you see the 4 and the 4. Each number tells us something. Now with the bar lines, the space in between the bar lines are referred to as measures. And measures are just segments. Imagine measures in the same way as you would words in a sentence. They are like segments of the song, which doesn't exist yet. If within those measures, we have to have something that makes sense to us. The top number in a time signature tells us how many beats or counts are in that measure. Remember, refer back to the meter. We have strong and weak beats, strong and weak counts in that measure. In this one, the 4 tells us there are 4 beats or counts in the measure. The bottom number is one that's really confusing for people. And the bottom number tells us what kind of note gets 1 count. Now, that goes to notes, which we're going to talk about later. But when we talk about notes, we understand that each note stands for a duration of time, and that time is measured through beats or counts. When we have a 4 in the bottom, that tells us that a quarter note gets 1 beat. Why a quarter? The 4, and this is where we get confused with fractions, a 4 is the bottom number of the fraction 1/4. and that's where it makes sense to us. 1/4. We use that word to explain that. So a quarter note gets 1 beat when the time signature is 4/4. In contrast, if you see a time signature that, say, has a 6 in the top and an 8 in the bottom, that means that the 8th note gets 1 count or 1 beat. Another very common one to see is a 2 in the bottom number, like 2/2, which means 2 beats in a measure, and a half note gets 1 count. Hope that's understandable. So again, time signature tells us the meter, and it tells us how many beats or counts are in a measure. That's the top number. And the bottom number tells us what kind of note gets 1 beat. Now that we have the staff set up, we can understand the basic building block for writing music. We have, in a sense, a blank canvas that we start putting notes on, and those notes, which are symbols that also tell us, as musicians, what we need to do with our instrument, whether it be our voice or a string instrument, wind instrument, whatever. The other thing that you need to know, there are different kinds of staffs. If you're a percussionist, for instance, you may have a staff that only has 1 line on it because your instrument doesn't play any pitches. If you're playing a snare drum part or a bass drum part, something like that, you may only have 1 line. That's just a staff for that particular instrument. You also may not have a clef. Percussion is another example. Non-pitched percussion, like snare drum or bass drum, may have what they call a percussion clef. It's 2 dark lines. And I can show all of that, and I might in the future as we're writing more music. But just understand that there are different clefs. I've only showed you the treble clef today. In a minute, I will show you the grand staff, which is the next important thing to learn, because then we're going to talk about notes. Now what you see on the screen is a grand staff. Grand staff is 2 staves, and one has a different clef. The one on the bottom has a clef called a bass clef. It's also referred to as the F clef. The 2 dots in the bass clef are surround or on opposite sides of the line that is the note F. The bass clef normally, and most time when it's used, is for lower sounding instruments. The grand staff is the staff that piano players or keyboard players use when they play, because they're playing usually left hand on the lower notes and right hand on the top of the higher notes. There are sometimes instruments that use the treble clef even though they play low sounds. And examples of this are the baritone saxophone and bass clarinets. And the reason for that is because all of the saxophones, from the soprano saxophone all the way up to the big bass saxophone, all are played the same, meaning that they use the same fingers to play the same notes. That's the same with the clarinets. And since clarinet players normally can move between the clarinets, just like the saxophones, they all use treble clef. In the grand staff, the other thing that's really important to know, that tendency to think that middle C is the middle of the piano. And it really isn't. It kind of is in the middle of the piano, but what it really means, it's the middle of the staff. And this is where, when we talk about notes, more importantly pitches, the grand staff shows all of them. And when I learned how to read the grand staff, it was a lot easier for me to understand pitch relativity and how it was written. Let me explain. So if I put notes on the grand staff and I start down here, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Now, this C and this C are the same. D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F. So those are the lines and spaces. Now, another thing to understand is that you can go higher than that. G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. We can also go lower than that. So let's take this A and put this A back here. A, G, F, E, D, C, B, A, G, F, E, D, C. The extended pitches above or below the 5 lines and spaces have little lines called ledger lines that extend the staves in treble or bass clef. As I mentioned before, this is how the development of the grand staff over time dealt with having too many lines and spaces. Remember though, going back to our discussion about middle C, these 2 notes between that red line are the same pitch, and we refer to that as middle C because it comes in the middle of the grand staff. And that's what we need to understand. The staff helps us understand relative pitch, low to high. It gives an opportunity for musicians to read the pitches and what they're supposed to play or sing based on where they are on the staff. The easiest way to think of it, if it's low on the staff, either one, treble or bass, it's a lower pitch. If it's higher on the staff, it's a higher pitch. We've given those pitches names so we can understand that particular sound. Composers want particular sounds. That's how we know what to play for what the composer wants, is by using those notes on the lines and spaces that define pitch for us, so we can then make music that someone else can play, and sometimes that someone else can play 200, 300, 400 years later. That's why we can play Mozart or Beethoven, or going back even farther, Bach and Handel. And those composers' music can be played as it was written back then, today, because of being able to have it written down using these symbols. Earlier in the lesson, I spoke of Guido di Arezzo of the 12th century, who is credited with creating the staff. In his time, notes were called neumes. And for many years, they were considered the first written symbols that delineated pitch and duration. As you can see on the screen, there's an example of neumes and what they mean. They are the predecessors to modern notation that we are familiar with today. They look similar, but are pretty different. You can tell by the pictures that you see that obviously there was some shape to them that told the musicians how long to hold a note or how short, and where they were placed on the staff in Guido's time, when he had a staff, would tell you how high or low to sing, mostly sing. And even before the staff, they were still put on the paper in a way that musicians could tell that they were high or low. However, in recent decades, musicologists have found that there is good evidence that notation systems existed even before the neumes. In the 1940s, a music educator, composer, and musicologist named Suzanne Hayek-Ventura, while studying notation in Paris while hiding from the Nazis in the 1940s, discovered markings in the biblical Psalms that she theorized were a notation system. These possible notations were about 3,500 years before the neumes were created in around 600 to 800 AD during Pope Gregory's time, during the time the music we know of today, or we call today Gregorian chant, was created. So it's important to note that music's been around for as long as humans have been around. And when did we first write it down? We originally, for many years, when I went to college, for instance, we were taught that the neumes were the first written notation. Therefore, that was the beginning of music history and an understanding of music history for modern times. Prehistory of music was prior to that. Now that might have changed. Now we have a possible notation system during the Psalms. And just so you understand, the word Psalms from the Bible, that translates as songs. We know that King David was probably one of our first great composers. He's who wrote the Psalms. And it doesn't surprise me that we may have had a notation system. You can tell by the picture here that those dots and little markings underneath the words could very well be a notation system. And in 1976, Miss Hayek-Ventura published her works, and it's now widely accepted that those markings were in fact a notation system. She had made recordings of the Psalms being played using that notation system, translated into today's modern notation system. There has even been older possible notation systems discovered. Also in the 1970s, and archaeological findings from the ancient Syrian city of Ugarit, once one of the great city-states of ancient Mesopotamia, where an ancient cuneiform tablet was found dating back to about 3400 BC. That's over 5,000 years ago. One of the tablets is believed to be a song, or rather a sad hymn in the ancient Hurric language. This hymn was about a barren woman praying to the moon goddess to bless her with a baby. We understood how to translate the language, the rhythm of the language, and the different markings above the actual letters, for lack of a better word, and the symbols that found the language, lent to it believed to be being a song. It has been studied and sang and recorded, and even some scholars felt that maybe there was a harp-like instrument, judging by what was written on the cuneiform tablet, that there may have been a harp-like instrument used in performing this song. So that is also a huge discovery, that not only did they sing, but they also may have accompanied themselves with instruments, which we kind of know many ancient peoples used instruments and more than likely sang along with those instruments. This particular cuneiform tablet is probably the oldest known musical score. A score is a written piece of music. So that's a little bit about the history of notation and where we've come throughout time to today and the modern notation that we use today. There's even differences and changes to notation being done today to handle different kinds of instrumentation in different instruments, or the way to play those instruments. We see that a lot of that in chamber music, and especially in percussion music and voice music that uses not just the voice but other parts of our body to make sounds. So that's a little bit about the history. Now let's get down to actually notes and how we read them today. Now that we understand the functions of the staff, clefs, at least treble and bass clefs, bar lines and measures, let's talk about notes. There are two ways for us to look at notes. First of all, there's when we place a note on a staff, then we're told what pitch we are supposed to play and sing as musicians. The most important function of notes is about duration. Different kinds of notes tell us how long or short to hold a note or play a note in music, as it refers to rhythm, one of the elements of music. Remember, rhythm is how music moves through time, and notes tell us how long that those notes need to be performed for. With this lesson, we will discuss notes and their relative durations with regards to the time signature with a 4 as the bottom number. Remember, that tells us that a quarter note gets 1 beat and 1 count. If the number at the bottom of a time signature is different, such as an 8 or a 2, then the durations are also different. What you see now is what I call a note tree. This diagram shows the relationship of durations with different kinds of notes. At the top of the tree is a whole note. Using a 4/4 time signature, a whole note gets 4 counts or beats. In relation, the next note down on the tree, a half note, gets 2 counts or beats. You can fit 2 half notes into the space of 1 whole note. Next, going down the tree are quarter notes, which have a duration of 1 counter beat. Below that, eighth notes, which have a half count, and the 16th notes that are 1/4 count in duration. As you can see, the quarter notes have a solid note head with a stem, as compared to a half note, open head with a stem, or a whole note with an open head and no stem. 8th and 16th notes have solid heads with stems, but an 8th note has a flag, 1 flag, and a 16th note has 2 flags. When 8th notes and 16th notes are combined, which happens often, actually more often in music than not, you can combine 2, 3, 4, or sometimes even more 8th notes or 16th notes, and instead of a flag, they have a beam for an 8th notes, 1 beam, or for 16th notes, they have 2 beams. And yes, there are even shorter notes or smaller duration notes. You have 32nd notes, you have 64th notes, and even bigger. You go up to 128th notes. They're very, very seldom seen. 32nd notes are sometimes seen in with slow-moving music that needs to have faster notes in it. The slow-tempoed music is a better way to put it. That gives you an idea of what the notes look like. And then when you put these notes in different patterns, they create rhythms, which is again how music moves through time. The other thing that's really important to understand when talking about placing notes on the staff is that you're placing those notes in measures. And those measures and the length of notes that can be in those measures is determined by the time signature. So if you have a time signature of 4/4, you can only have 4 counts in that measure, no more or no less. In most music writing programs today, that takes care of that for you. If you put a half note, for instance, into a 4/4 measure, and then you don't put any more notes in it, it'll put a rest in there automatically. Which brings me to the fact that in this next figure or diagram, you see another tree. This tree is not of notes, it's of rests. Remember back to our definition of music, that music is a combination of sounds and silence. The sounds delineated by the notes, and the silence is delineated or notated through rests. So there's also whole, half, quarter, eighth, 16th rests, so on and so forth. So these two note and or rest trees complement each other. I know that lesson was a little bit long, but now you have learned some things about some of the symbols of music: the staff, clefs, bar lines, measures, and notes. We'll have to have future lessons on even more symbols of music, but for now, we have some musical building blocks to begin to really understand how music is made. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. There's more to come. Please subscribe, like, and hopefully share this with others so more people can learn about music theory. Thank you.